Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
City Hall reporter Joshua Fechter
and investigative reporter Brian Chasnoff.
We're a couple of weeks away from the beginning of early voting in San Antonio municipal elections, and this past week we got some information about how fundraising is going for mayoral and city council candidates. Josh, you wrote a story about that. I was sort of surprised at how much money both Mayor Ron Nirenberg and his challenger Greg Brockhouse have raised. I mean, this period was the 30-day reports that they submitted. So this was basically from January 1st until about March 22nd or something. And I was surprised by how much both of them raised.
Yeah, both of them, Mayor Nirenberg and, former Councilman Greg Brockhouse have been saying kind of this whole time, hey, it's a difficult fundraising environment. You're coming up against the economic fallout from the pandemic. So if you're a business owner, it's a little bit more difficult for you to raise money. If you're worried about making rent or a mortgage payment, you're probably not going to be as likely to give. And that's kind of been true for campaigns throughout the pandemic. That didn't really seem to be the case this time around. Both men are raising more money than they ever have before. As a result, you're seeing Nirenberg has raised about $318K. That's about double what he raised during the same time period the last campaign. Brockhouse doubled basically his fundraising from the previous period in the last cycle. But, they both kind of have their disadvantages here. Nirenberg started out the race with less in the bank than he did 2 years ago. So he's kind of having to make up for that. Brockhouse doesn't have the financial backing of the police and fire unions this time. The fire union is not endorsing in the race, at least for now.
And he got hundreds of thousands of dollars from them last time, right? I mean, that was a big factor.
It was hundreds of thousands of dollars that they both spent. I think it was well over $500K on that race. The police union has its hands full with the Fix SAPD campaign fighting Proposition B, which is to decide whether the police union will keep their collective bargaining rights. Danny Diaz, who's the head of the police union, has said, hey, it's pretty likely we're going to endorse in the campaign or in the mayoral race, but they haven't yet.
And probably won't put much money in anyway. Yeah.
So basically, it's probably going to be a little bit more difficult for the police union to endorse this time around, because Danny Diaz is the new leader of the police union. They're going through kind of this sort of rebuilding kind of phase. They've got new faces in leadership, and Nirenberg a couple of weeks ago went and met with the police union leadership and told them that he supports collective bargaining,
right?
Which probably makes it more difficult for them to come out against him. But they're supposed to come out with their endorsement sometime this month, so we'll see whether that actually had that effect.
And Josh, the only sitting council member to say that they support Fix SAPD is Roberto Trevino, correct?
Yes. So council is just kind of is trying to stay out of it for the most part. The council got basically this legal advice from the city attorney, Andy Segovia, saying, try not to weigh in on this. As far as I understand it, that's what the advice was. Wow. Was to sort of not weigh in on it just because, they believe that it would jeopardize the ongoing collective bargaining negotiations over the new contract. There are a couple of people who have flouted that. Trevino is in favor, and Manny Pelaez came out against it pretty early on. Yeah,
and Brockhouse has made the case that in 2018, when we had 3 propositions on the ballot from the fire union, Nirenberg was very open about his opposition to that and campaigned against that. So, I mean, I understand what the city attorney has said, but I mean, I think that council members, I would expect them to weigh in on something this important, and I'm sure there's some who just kind of don't want to get involved in it. I was going to say that With regard to Brockhouse, I would recommend anybody listening to the podcast read a profile that ran over the weekend in the Express News by our colleague Bruce Selcraig. It's a really excellent piece that I think kind of captures the complexity of Greg Brockhouse, the gifted politician who often gets in his own way, and someone who tends to grandstand at times, but also in some cases will surprise council members with his and others with his willingness to sort of change his opinions and maybe take heed of other people's suggestions. But it's a really interesting piece. And in there, he pointed out, Brockhouse pointed out, that because of Proposition B, that he didn't really expect the police union to be able to, whether they endorsed or not, that he didn't really expect them to be able to put significant money into his campaign. So I think he came into this knowing that he just was not going to be, the climate was not going to be the same for him as it was in 2019.
Yeah, he seems to have made adjustments. So this time he perhaps had to make more of an effort to fundraise, which kind of runs counter to what both men are saying, is that it's kind of awkward to go and ask people for money during this time, just given the financial strain that people are under. So which one is true? But something I wanted to, before we got too far away from it, Gilbert, you mentioned that council members, and the mayor took sides on the fire union propositions,
right?
Back in 2018, that took place during this years long spat between the city and the fire union over their contracts. So I mean, was that legal advice given then? But I mean, it's clear that they're able to do it, and perhaps they, as you said, are just not willing. But I wanted to at least make that point clear as well.
That's a great point.
I've got a question for both of you guys. Do you feel like the mayor has explained adequately how he can tell the union that he supports collective bargaining, but then also claim to be neutral on the proposition?
It doesn't really make sense to me, quite honestly, because if you're saying that you conceptually support the collective bargaining process, you're saying that in a way is saying that you don't agree with the proposition.
It's a transitive property.
Yeah, you don't. That's basically saying you don't agree with the premise of Proposition B, because Proposition B is based on the premise that collective bargaining does not work, at least in San Antonio, because the unions have had too much leverage and they exploit the process. And so he does not seem to agree with that premise. And so it sounds to me like he has issues with Proposition B, but he doesn't necessarily want to take a stand on it.
Well, you also see other candidates taking that exact sort of tactic, which is, I'm going to say, I support Fix SAPD in one case with Terry Castillo, who's running for council in District 5. I support the aims of Fix SAPD, but she stops short of saying she's in favor of Prop B. Mario Bravo, running in District 1, says he doesn't that he supports collective bargaining, but says he's staying neutral on Prop B. I don't see. Yeah, I'm like you, Gilbert. I don't see how that's not taking a position on the matter.
Yeah. Well, Brian,
you're telegraphing how you feel about it.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
Brian, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the story that you and Emily Eaton have worked on regarding the Fire Chief Charles Hood's son, who was arrested last June at the airport. And I think that what's interesting about the story, I mean, there are a lot of things interesting about the what happened there, the rift between the chief and Police Chief McManus. But I also am really interested in the sort of open records aspect of this, which I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about, because that's also becoming an issue in the mayoral race. For anyone who isn't familiar with the story, could you just talk a little bit about what happened with the fire chief's son last June?
Sure. So last June, Fire Chief Charles Hood's 17-year-old son was arrested at the San Antonio International Airport for possessing a fake ID and failing to identify it to a police officer. He was arrested, taken to jail, and this caused a rift between Chief Hood and Police Chief William McManus ultimately, because Hood disagreed with how the arrest went down. He thought it was overkill for his son to be detained. This was at the height of protests, the racial justice protests that exploded last year. So the atmosphere was quite tense at the time. And so it appears that the city reacted to this situation where you had the fire chief who was upset at how the police handled the arrest of his son, but you have the police chief saying that the arrest was done by the book. The city ended up hiring an outside attorney, who charged, I think it was $325 an hour to essentially interview folks who were involved in the incident and come to a conclusion about whether racial bias was involved, because that was Chief Hood's concern, was that his son, Chief Hood, who's black, and his son, who's black, his son was detained because of the color of his skin. Ultimately, the review found that there was no racial bias. Actually, City Attorney Andy Segovia released a statement that said the review's conclusion was that there was no racial bias, but that it could have been handled differently. They didn't explain what that meant. And yeah, as you say, Gilbert, the other side, the other dimension to this story is that everything I just told you was the result of the reporting by Emily Eaton and myself. Otherwise, the city was very secretive about the arrest, the rift between the police and fire chief, the taxpayer-funded review, which ended up costing, I think, a little over $5,000. Council wasn't even told. Melissa Haverda, who is the chair of the council's public safety committee, she was the only person who would even talk to us about it. I think she felt a responsibility because of her position on the committee. It was just so Emily Eaton, our colleague at the Express News, she was on this story for a long time before I got involved. I think it was about 6 months that the city was refusing to release a copy of the arrest report, which ultimately was expunged.
Brian, do you know why did they provide any excuse, or did they was there any response or justification for the?
They never cited a specific reason for keeping the record from the public, even though that's required by law.
I think this is, like I said, it's fascinating on so many levels, and I think that the open records issue is one that it's sort of been bubbling under the surface in San Antonio for a while. I think we've seen fellow reporters at different outlets in the city, express concerns about how long this is taking. I just know private citizens who have filed open records requests who have had some issues, and it's been complicated by the fact that during the pandemic, I think the city has stated that they've been shorthanded, and so the process has been slowed down. And so, I think it's made things, more difficult. But one of the things that's happened is last week, Greg Brockhouse's campaign put out an email. They had screenshots of open records requests that he submitted. I think he submitted several just like on February 22nd, related to Ron Nirenberg's office expenses, communications within the mayoral office, and he hasn't had those requests fulfilled, and so he is threatening to sue if he doesn't, if the city does not provide the information he's seeking. Josh, how much of an issue? Sometimes I wonder with open records. I think this is a really important issue, but I sometimes wonder how much the public, really, focuses, or how much interest they have when we're talking about, something like that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it can seem like a lot of sort of inside baseball, sort of journalism, Twitter sort of thumb sucking on a lot of this. Like, people don't care about like what journalists have problems with, but like the the underlying issue here is, being able to have a view into how, the city operates, how its leaders make decisions, how tax dollars are spent. Right. And so like, I think that's something that, people can care about. And I also know that, reporters on Twitter do tend to complain about the open records request aspect. I have several myself that I'm waiting to hear back on to some degree. Like, I have records, and this is kind of the normal back and forth of being a reporter. Like some of it is, you ask for a lot of records and they come back to you with a cost estimate of several $100s, and you have to whittle the request down. And sometimes those are left, pending because, you're trying to figure it out yourself, how you want to, what records you actually want. And then, on the other end, there are just open records requests that have just been sitting there unattended to, for months, if not years. I have one request from last January that was that I filed. It was before the pandemic. It was before it really hit our shores here. And it was never responded to, and I went and asked about it, and we'll see when they'll release those records now. But by law, they're supposed to. You basically have about 10 business days if you're the city to either to release the records or seek an opinion from the Texas Attorney General, before releasing the records. And the other thing that we should say, you touched on this. They've said the pandemic has kind of slowed their ability to respond to records requests. The other component of that is that the AG basically allowed them to do that under the state's disaster declaration. And so, basically, if you filed an open records request within a certain time period last year, basically they had basically an infinite amount of time to respond to it under the law. And they only just started processing records again back in November. And so like if you filed something in April and they came back in November and treated it as if it had just been filed. But even then I have records requests that have not been responded to.
Basically we're in a state now where if something was filed in February, as Brockhouse has said, he filed several during that period. This would be considered after the disaster period, and the city would have no justification for failing to get that information to him. Right? Is that right?
Sure. I'm not. I don't know exactly what his. I read the press release, but I don't know exactly what his case is off the top of my head. But basically, like if. Like in November, whenever it was that they opened it back up in November, they would have had 10 business days to either provide the records or contest the records release with the AG. If they thought that there was something in those records that that basically was unreleasable under state law.
Well, before we wrap things up, I wanted to talk briefly with you, Josh, about the city council's action last week to create a registry for COVID-19 vaccinations. It's something that's been talked about for a while. There have been people in the city who've been frustrated about the fact that we didn't have one, whereas other big cities in Texas did. What led to this finally happening after all the talk about it?
So basically what happened was the state opened up eligibility to everyone. Every Texas adult anyway. So for months you'd had this debate within City Hall over to whether to set up some kind of one-stop, vaccine registry that, basically you go in, you put in your information, they say, thanks, we'll let you know when an appointment's available. The idea behind that is kind of like, just so you don't have to go through calling 1,000 times to try to schedule an appointment, or try to get through on a website to where, it doesn't crash on you and you can manage to get through and schedule an appointment. This was very frustrating to Councilman John Courage. He kept pointing out that San Antonio was the only major Texas city without one of these kinds of these registries. Other major Texas cities have them, but they kind of vary in degrees of their scope. For the longest time, Metro Health was against the idea. It was like, look, Colleen Bridger, who's the head of Metro Health, basically was saying, this is not going to ease anyone's anxiety. It's not going to really help people schedule appointments because, there's not enough vaccine. Really, that is the main problem here. And all that is just set up to say that what happened was Texas opened up eligibility to every Texas adult. This kind of freaked out some on council, who, for various reasons. One being that, people in priority groups, people with underlying health conditions, seniors, still were not fully vaccinated. Like, those groups were still not fully vaccinated, and here they were going to have to start competing with every other person in the state to schedule these appointments. So that kind of lit the fire under this whole process. And so what they basically came to was a system that at least encompassed, the 4 mass vaccination sites. The 2 sites run by WellMed, the Alamo Dome, and the University Health site at Wonderland of Americas. And basically, like, how that's going to work is you just put in your information, and they'll get back to you on vaccine availability. But there are a couple of questions raised at the council meeting. One, how much is this going to cost the city? Somewhere between 100,000 to 200,000 was the number that was bandied about. And then, how quickly this was going to be stood up, which I think is going to be more pressing. At the time, this was last week, they were, city staff was saying this could take 3 to 4 weeks to put together. Wow. So nobody's appointment woes have been eased just yet. It's still going to take a little while for them to put this up. But it's not going to be the sort of broad, sort of sweeping, like if an appointment pops up anywhere in the city and you're on this list, you're automatically going to get notified about it. And the other point to this, I'm sorry, I'm filibustering here. But the other component to this is that it's for seniors. Not just anybody can sign up for this list. It's 65 and over.
And I would think that there are probably many people for whom this is not necessarily going to get them an earlier appointment, but it would make the process probably less frustrating, because I think it is kind of maddening for people when, I know a lot of people who just, you hear about an opening at one of the sites and then you try to get to, on their website as fast as you can. And sometimes you don't get there fast enough. And it's just this kind of thing where you're just going from one place to another, hoping to get an opening. And I think that this seems to create a kind of a more coherent sort of approach to it. And you might not get an earlier date, but you don't have to go through all that frustration. I think that's probably what's going to happen. And hopefully it'll make the process better for people. Well, I think we're going to wrap things up there. I wanted to mention to listeners of the podcast, If you have any questions, if you have issues you'd like to hear us talk about, we're always open to that. I think we're getting an email for the podcast that's exclusive to the podcast. But for now, if you send a tweet with the hashtag PudoPolitics, we will take a look at it, and we're totally open to answering any questions or talking about anything you all want to hear us talk about. Hope you all are doing well. Take care, and we'll be back next week. Thanks.